thank you, Renata, and to the chair of the PILON Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Working Group, Madam Attorney General, Robert. Thank you also to the PILON Advisory Panel, Secretariat, and the City of Australian Commonwealth Attorney General's Department and staff, Assistant Commissioner Marlene, for a great presentation with Justice Gowda, dignitaries and delegates. I'd like to start by acknowledging sovereign First Peoples of the lands and waters where we meet. I would also like to acknowledge all victim survivors here today and those who didn't survive, and pay my respects to their friends and family. I also acknowledge my personal privilege as a white, able-bodied, cisgendered, educated person, as well as my own lived experience as a victim survivor of child sexual abuse, teen sexual violence, and protracted domestic and family violence. Last year, I had the very good fortune to be the chief investigator on a literature review that looked at many jurisdictions globally to understand the nature of trauma caused by sexual violence, cues or trigger points in a criminal justice process that can cause re-traumatization for the victim survivor's justice needs, and how we as actors in the justice system can respond. And we distilled a suite of best practice measures to reduce re-traumatization and barriers to reporting. And I'm very pleased to say that pretty much all of the measures that Justice Gowda just mentioned are on our list of best practice measures. But really, out of all of that research that we did, it became very clear that we can only really start meaningfully thinking about how to address re-traumatization and barriers to reporting by first understanding trauma and trauma-informed care and a victim survivor's justice needs. So, for today's talk, and this one's going to go for about an hour, so I'll try and cut it short. If I hear people snoozing, I'll speed things up for you. But we'll start with a bit of context. We've already heard about the context. I'm sure many of you are familiar with very sobering statistics on sexual violence and domestic violence globally, in fact, but also barriers to reporting. Then we'll look a bit at the rationale for adopting trauma-informed care. Then I want to spend most of today's talk on the nature of trauma caused by sexual violence. So a little bit about this neurobiology. I promise it won't be a science lesson, but how this impacts on a victim survivor's behaviour, injuries that can be suffered, memory and giving evidence, and then we'll loop back to discuss trauma-informed interactions and how we as practitioners can address the victim survivor's justice needs. And I've got a picture of the guidelines there because they really are an excellent example of what we call the 5R framework for trauma-informed care. In terms of prevalence, it's been said that violence against women and girls is the security threat that results in direct physical violence for the largest number of people in the Pacific. Teens and women aged 15 to 49 years, up to 68% experience physical and or sexual violence. For girls before their 15th birthday, up to 37%. Ever partnered men aged 18 to 49 years were reported as perpetrating physical and or sexual violence, and 59% rape. The literature around police reporting and the prospect of a successful prosecution is a little thinner. But one of the studies we looked at, 2014 study on public opinion, disproportionately low reporting rate. That's no different really to the issue globally. It's a globally very, very low rate, around about 11%. So if you think to yourself, oh, about an 11% odd reporting rate, when we looked at, I think it was Mercy's presentation previously, and they established some baseline data. So for example, when we think about Papua New Guinea, I think their baseline data was around 350. So if you're looking at about a 10 or 11% reporting rate, you're looking at 3,550, not 350. I think that's what we need to keep in mind. And just a bit of quick maths I did on my phone there. If you break that down weekly, that's almost 10 a week. No, 70 a week, 10 a day. So massive numbers there, reporting very low, successful prosecution, the same study that I was just talking about, 2014, as low as 1 in 338 for women and 1 in 192 for kids. Very sobering statistics there. Barriers, we've already heard Justice Downer talk about the very significant barriers that exist to reporting in my report. We spend pages on the barriers that exist for victim survivors in reporting. But throughout all of our discussion of the barriers, there were two main things. Firstly, the stigma and shame that victim survivors feel in terms of reporting, that sense of isolation and a very real fear of reprisal. But in terms of why we're here today, fear of treatment in the criminal justice process, if they sought accountability, was the other really big factor, and particularly fear of treatment in the cross-examination process. And what we were just talking about, that belligerent, bullying kind of questioning, the inordinately long questioning, the tagging questioning from defence counsel can be a real problem. So in terms of the Pacific Islands more specifically, the studies indicate a prevalence of cultural and religious barriers, so things like protecting the family, silence about unpleasant issues, self-blame, belief that things in life are temporary, worse things could happen. Other studies show embedded social norms, like the wife's duty to obey her husband. It facilitates discipline and control and victim blaming. But the UN also found that there was a very real problem with the formal support services on the ground. Around 80%, as you would know, of the population in the Pacific Islands lives on remote islands or outer islands. Rural areas, so there's a lack of formal support services, but even where they exist, the UN found that they were not utilised as much as they could be, unfortunately. So very sobering statistics, formidable level of barriers. And so one of the answers, I mean, there's many parts to this discussion, isn't there? But one of the potential means of addressing this is trauma-informed prosecution. So I guess we come to the question, the big question, what's in it for us? Why should we adopt a trauma-informed prosecution process? The literature shows prosecutors are often seen by victim survivors as the gateway to justice. The gateway to justice. And they're really very uniquely situated because of their ongoing relationship with the victim survivor to either engage and empower them, and then research shows they tend to persist with the prosecution process, or to further alienate and disconnect them. And the studies do show there are two ways that a victim survivor can be unintentionally re-traumatised by prosecutors. And you'll note that both of these really hinge on behaviour, conduct by the prosecutor. So a lack of a basic understanding of trauma and its impacts can mean that our language and demeanour unwittingly replicates those same dynamics that the victim survivor experienced during the assault. So that loss of control, loss of power, no voice. Also, a prosecutor's own vicarious trauma can lead to compassion fatigue, and this is completely understandable. often it can be our own automatic response when we're feeling overwhelmed with dealing with victim survivors day in, day out, hearing distressing details, to want to detach somewhat, have that professional demeanour, but that can lead to sometimes a hurried demeanour, impersonal, or a lack of empathy. And victim survivors are very acutely attuned to this kind of behaviour. And vicarious trauma is quite interesting because it can not only lead to issues personally for the prosecutor, but it can also lead to legal liability on the part of the agency that employs the prosecutors. And here I'm thinking of a High Court of Australia case a couple of years ago where a Victorian specialist prosecutor sued because she developed PTSD and won around about almost 500,000 Australian dollars in compensation. So very serious issues around this stuff. And here I just want to flag for you what I'm sure will be a very interesting session on vicarious trauma with Professor Iane tomorrow. So there's something to stay tuned for. So in terms of the rationale, there really are benefits for everyone in adopting trauma-informed practice. Not just for the victim survivor who stands a much better chance of having their justice needs met and therefore persisting with the prosecution. Obviously builds a better rapport with the prosecutor. You can get better evidence. It then in the middle leads to building better cases. But in terms of the prosecutor, a level of trauma awareness and being trauma informed allows us to spot the flags of when our own behaviour might be trauma driven and to seek some help seeking behaviour. Look for your network of supports. Go and speak to people. It also allows us to spot trauma-driven behaviour in our colleagues, so it can facilitate a more open dialogue around help-seeking behaviour. And as I said, leads back to the middle. Getting better evidence means building better cases, so our performance is lifted. But even more broadly, if you want an academic's perspective on this stuff, it has a broader societal and cultural impact. If you persist in trauma-informed practice over time, you're not just impacting individual victim survivors, you're collectively influencing social, cultural shifts. You're influencing a shift in perspective from the criminal justice system as a re-traumatizing system to a reaffirming system that builds confidence in the criminal justice system and even more broadly for the rule of law itself. So there really is something in it for everyone. The big caveat here, obviously we'll be talking about trauma. I'm not a mental health professional. We'll be hearing from a mental health professional, and I'm a legal researcher with obviously being a victim survivor, very keen interest in law reform in this area. Also, I gather most of you folks are not mental health professionals, so we go about engaging trauma-informed prosecution practice. The good news is that we don't need a medical level understanding of trauma. You just need a basic understanding of trauma and its impacts, how to empower rather than re-traumatize victim survivors. And there's some very good research coming out of the US. This framework is about 10 years old now. Suggests that a good framework has 4 R's, and it's actually just been expanded to 5 R's, but realise the widespread impact of trauma, and that awareness of trauma is essential for all human service sectors. Recognise the signs and symptoms of trauma in pretty much everyone in the justice process. Respond by integrating our knowledge into policies, procedures and practices. And this is exactly what the guidelines do. And actively seek to resist re-traumatisation. And that last one is kind of the key theme that I'll be calling through my talk today. But we'll look back and discuss these 4 and now 5 R's later in talk. But how do we start the conversation about trauma? I thought one of the best ways potentially would be to talk about the kind of conduct that we may see across the desk from us on a daily basis. So victim survivors might be unable to tell their story chronologically. They might experience overwhelming grief on a particular detail. They might not be very communicative. They might just rely on yes or no answers. Or on the other side of the scale, they might tell their story repeatedly, focusing on what might seem to us as very minor details. And we'll talk about memory in a minute. But they might become suspicious when you write notes. There might be huge swings of emotion. They might not be able to keep track of things, unable to stand up for their own interests, can't make decisions, won't sign documents. All of this kind of behaviour, when we confront it on a daily basis, it's very easy to slip into that kind of mental monologue of what's wrong with this person? You know, I just want to do my job. But the first step in understanding trauma is really to flip that on its head. When you catch yourself thinking, what's wrong with you? Instead, to engage with that empathy and that compassion that the victim survivor needs and start saying things like, what happened to you? What's happening for you? And even if you don't say it to the victim survivor, you will communicate it through your non-verbal language, through your body language. So, in terms of really unpacking trauma, and I'm an academic, so I'll do what academics do, and I'll start with a definition. There are lots of different definitions of trauma, and there's no one accepted definition of trauma. I don't like most of them because they're very clinical. They really don't capture what happens for a victim survivor upon sexual assault. Particularly in terms of the Australian First Nations literature on this, they make the very pertinent observation that most of the clinical definitions of trauma completely leave out that whole aspect of how it affects the victim survivor's spiritual path, their spirituality, their connection to ancestor, to country. Yes, so probably the best definition that kind of alludes to that is one that's come out of the US. Trauma results from an event, series of events experienced as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, long-lasting effects on the individual's functioning, and physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. There's lots of different ranges of trauma, from very mild to very, very severe. But at its significant end, it has the capacity to affect almost every area of a victim survivor's life. Fundamentally, there's a sense of overwhelm, and you're cut off from your ordinary sense of control, connection, and meaning. And there's very good research now that shows that trauma is actually embodied. It's stored in our cells. There are structural changes that go on in our brains. And so we need to know a little bit about neurobiology and how it impacts behaviour, health, and memory. And I don't want you to panic in the next slide. This is not a science lesson, I promise. But the easiest way to explain this stuff is with a hand model of the brain. So if you think of my wrist as the spinal column, my palm is the brain stem, my thumb would be the limbic region, which is the oldest region of the brain. And this is the region that's responsible for sensing danger. It's constantly surveying the landscape, what you see, hear, smell, touch, sound, all the five senses. It filters all of that information through your already stored memories, and it is equipped to respond extremely quickly, 12 milliseconds it can take before danger is sensed, and it can kick into action. Then, curling over the front, we have the prefrontal cortex, and this is the part of the brain that engages in rational thought. So if we think in terms of a normally functioning brain and a normal scenario where you're walking along a path and you see something, and immediately that old limbic part of your brain might think there's a snake, and before you've even consciously thought about it, you've taken your foot up, taken a step back, and then the prefrontal cortex kicks in, you look down, it's just a stick. It's just a tree branch. So you can keep going on your way, no problem. But in times of trauma, like sexual assault, what happens is this: if you look at number 1 in red, the amygdala, which is that little red almond-shaped organ there, actually there's 2 of them on either side of your brain, senses the danger and sends a signal to the hypothalamus. Okay. The hypothalamus there in purple, number 2 in purple. The hypothalamus signals to the pituitary gland and the adrenal, and this HPA axis signals a release of a flood of hormones: adrenaline, cortisone, catecholamines, all sorts of things, a hormonal soup, if you will. And that hormonal flood does a whole bunch of things, but for our purposes, number 3 in purple, it reduces, and they've done brain imaging of victim survivors with PTSD. It actually takes the prefrontal cortex offline. So your rational thinking brain comes offline, as Dan Siegel says, who invented this hand model. You flip your lid, basically, and your behaviour is being regulated by that old limbic system. So the important point here is what a victim survivor does next is not within their conscious, rational control. Okay. It's all very much being run by the need to survive. So look, what happens next? Many people will know all about the fight or flight response that's been discussed forever. But there's actually many more. I think there's more than 4, and research seems to keep expanding these, but we'll talk about the 4 because they're the most solidly discussed in the literature. Often, when you think of fight or flight, this is what we like to think we would do in the event of a sexual assault. If this happened to me, this is what I'm sure I will do. And unfortunately, as Justice Gounder said, there's misconceptions, great myths, and they seep in to our thinking and implicit bias, and it's often expected that a victim survivor will engage in a fight or flight response. Unfortunately, in court, many times where victim survivors have frozen during the attack, or where they've engaged in thwarting behaviour, which is just doing whatever the perpetrator says because they just want to survive, they just want to make it through. Many times those kinds of behaviours are put forward as an argument that either the victim survivor consented or that the threat was not as serious as was being presented. But actually what happens in pretty much most cases they're finding is that initially everyone goes into freeze. It's what we call a stop, look, listen response. It allows our brain to orient to the danger and to filter through those memories very quickly. As I said, the limbic brain happens very, very quickly with all of the reactions that go on there. And it allows us to then decide what the best action is in the situation. Now, remember, this is not rational thought that's going on here. This is just survival-driven behaviour So it's been shown that the responses are gendered. So men tend to engage in the fight or flight, and women tend to engage in the fawn reflex, the fawn response, very commonly, and anywhere from 37 to 70% of women engage in the freeze response. Sometimes that's called tonic immobility. And the best way I've heard it described is it's like having your foot on the brake pedal of your car on full, and at the same time, the gas pedal on full. You're aware, but your body's not responding. But they're the typical behaviours. How does that play out in what we see? It can present as a bit challenging for us, again. Freezing response, if you don't understand why freezing can happen and that it's absolutely normal and a survival-driven response, can seem kind of counterintuitive. Appearing flat or unemotional rather than expressive, we often expect that a victim survivor is going to be rather hysterical, but that's not necessarily the case. Not saying no or even opening a door to a perpetrator, continuing a relationship with the perpetrator, denying or minimising, delaying reporting, all of that classic kind of fawning-driven behaviour. Having huge swings. Remember this hormonal soup. The hormonal levels are elevated for around up to 96 hours after an assault. So it's not surprising that there's huge emotional swing. Delayed responses to questions, recall difficult, recall has inconsistencies. All of that relates to memory, which we'll loop back and talk about in just a moment. But the point here is that these behaviours that emerge as a very understandable and survival-driven response can actually persist for a very, very long time. And where you have difficult behaviours, so like I said, adaptive in the sense that they'll get you through the moment, but where they persist can certainly cause very, very challenging problems for a victim survivor. So longer than a month, you can have these kinds of symptoms and they're impairing your function. You may develop post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. It's on the big US diagnostics manual as a line, and they keep tinkering around with the qualifications, but it's been on the diagnostics manual for quite some time. It's important to remember that every victim survivor is different, and not all victim survivors will go on to develop PTSD. It's really on a case-by-case basis. It's going to depend on the victim survivor's level of resilience, on the severity of the trauma, the severity of the assault, and all the individual circumstances of the case. But interestingly, for women, the highest risk of developing PTSD is associated with it. Now, I don't need you to look at all the tiny writing in yellow, but what I do want you to notice is the four main clusters of symptoms here. So, re-experiencing the event. That's one of the key hallmarks of PTSD. Avoiding anything to do with the event. Hypervigilance or reactivity, so that amygdala is stuck on hyper alert, looking for danger all the time, even though there might not be, with our rational minds, there might not be any danger present. Negative impacts on cognition and mood. And the two clusters of the symptoms that I want you to notice particularly are re-experiencing and that hypervigilance. These victim survivors are very, very vulnerable to re-traumatization. And so this is the scientific side of really why we need to be adopting a trauma-informed approach. If the nature of the assault is quite severe and repeated, or if there are different forms of trauma that occur, typically like in, say, domestic violence, where you might have sexual abuse, you might have physical, emotional, financial abuse as well. So where you've got different forms of trauma, or multiple forms of trauma, then the risk of complex trauma is significantly increased. Now, this one's not on the US Diagnostics Manual, but it is recognised by global authorities like the World Health Organization, and that's where I've drawn this discussion from. But again, there's a number of different clusters of symptoms. So usually you'll have the kind of symptoms that you would have for PTSD, plus what we call self-ordering disorganization. So over there, third column, self-belief, persistently negative, deep and pervasive feelings of shame, feelings of guilt. And this is particularly associated with where the victim survivor has frozen and succumbed to the event, or been unable to protect loved ones from suffering, like, for example, child abuse in DFV scenarios. Very deep feelings of guilt or failure, being permanently damaged, despair. So all of those kinds of self-belief, and also then unsurprisingly, that has a knock-on effect in the victim survivor's relationships with others. Okay. So what I want you to notice, I don't know if it's too small to see, but I'll read it down the bottom there. Symptoms result in significant impairment in personal, family, social, educational, occupational, and or other areas of functioning. So like I said, when you have trauma at its severe levels, it really can impact on pretty much every part of a victim survivor's life. And it said that their functioning is maintained, it's only through significant additional effort. So life can just become grey, and it's just a matter of trying hard to put one foot in front of the other, just to function normally. Again, these two clusters of symptoms, those for PTSD and affect regulation there, so heightened emotional reactivity to what can be very minor stressors. Again, they show us why we need to be treating these vulnerable victim survivors with compassion and trauma-informed care. So looking more at the symptoms for victim survivors, the main hallmark, as I said, is re-experiencing. So I'll start again with a definition of re-traumatization, and that is a conscious or unconscious reminder of past trauma that results in a re-experiencing of the initial trauma event. It can be triggered by a situation, an attitude or expression, or by certain environments that replicate the dynamics of the original trauma. And we'll talk about memory a bit more in just a moment, but as you're going through a sexual assault, your brain is taking what they sometimes call flashbulb memories of the event. And you've got those memories there stored in your canvas. It can take only a 10 to 20% overlap in similarity between those memories and something that you encounter, a location, a smell, a visual image, and all of a sudden, the victim survivor can be swept back into the moment of the assault, to the point where they can even re-experience all of the physical symptoms that they experienced in the original assault, elevated heart rate and anxious behaviour and all of that kind of stuff. You may see them, in your office, and then all of a sudden, you're seeing this behaviour manifest. Classic signs that they're re-experiencing. So, Judith Herman, in a very well-respected book, basically said that if you could purposely design an institution where its job was to re-traumatize trauma victims, it would be the criminal justice process. Just the power dynamics of themselves can be sufficient to re-traumatize them. So again, makes trauma-informed practice just essential. Other symptoms, well, there's just a long list, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I have actually, listed a lot of this stuff in my paper. The paper should be in your materials. And complete with, I'm a good academic, complete with all the citations in case you want to hunt down the reports, etc. for yourself. But anxiety, panic attacks, nightmares, major depression, PTSD, complex trauma, dissociation, where the victim survivor just needs to feel safe, so they want to just detach from everyone and everything to feel like they have some sense of control. Addictions, now this is something I wanted to point out to you. Addictions as a comorbidity with trauma are quite common, but everyone thinks of drug and alcohol addictions, but you don't tend to think of things like over-exercising, overworking. And the problem with those kinds of addictions is that everyone thinks, this is great, she's getting on with it. Look at her, she's so productive at work. She's exercising, she's doing everything that she should be doing. I don't exercise. But when they impair our functioning, they can be just as problematic as drug and alcohol addictions. Predisposition to suicide. So here, there was a very large study of over 100,000 people, and the greatest risk of elevation in risk of suicide was for victim survivors of sexual violence, followed by victim survivors of interpersonal violence. So that speaks for itself. And the case that Justice Gandar mentioned, classic kind of case there. But there are other problems, emotional and social symptoms. These are the ones that are particularly addressed on that complex trauma sheet there, but mood, affective disorders, aggression, agitation, hostility, self-destructive behaviour, problems feeling any sense of pleasure or joy. Can't try and describe it like life has gone away. There's just almost nothing worth living for. Feelings of shame, guilt, social isolation, along with dissociation, that can be just trying to get away from everything, trying to establish your own little bubble of control again. Obviously, this can be made worse by all of that suite of intersectional factors. So, social, financial, racism, economics, unemployment, poverty. There's a quote that I've got from a 16-year-old survivor in my paper that basically says, I have to go back to my perpetrator. I live with him. If I don't, I'm homeless. I've nowhere else to go. So they're the psychological issues, massive range of physical injuries and symptoms that can emerge, trauma as well. But obviously there's all of the suite of injuries that can happen during or immediately after the assault. These symptoms can be really long-term reproductive problems, pelvic pain. There's many cases of diffuse and undiagnosed pain, particularly in the abdomen area. And there's a lot of new study coming out on the mind-gut connection. So gastrointestinal problems are not uncommon. Many more, like I said, I've got some of them listed in the paper there if you want to hunt those up. But in terms of memory, we'll just revisit our friend again for a moment. Jim Hopper, who is a Harvard psychologist, puts it this way. He says, ignorance of how memory works is a major reason why sexual assault is the easiest violent crime to get away with across our country and around the world. That might be putting it at its highest. There's some caveats, I guess, that before we start talking about trauma and memory. This is a rapidly evolving area of research, and a lot of these conclusions have been built on animal models or participation in trials that are not specifically sexual assault oriented. And there are some debates in the literature on the fringes as to exactly what the various points mean for us. But what an understanding of the neurobiology of trauma and memory will do for us is that it can help us understand the ways, very plausible explanations of how memory can be influenced and expressed by victim survivors, and it can help us keep an open mind and perhaps question some of our own implicit biases and stereotypes around credibility when we are confronted with a victim survivor telling their narrative. So we know our good old friend, the amygdala in red, sends a signal to the hypothalamus and the APA axis, releases the hormones. It takes our rational thinking offline. And also, interestingly, in relation to memory, it does a couple of things. This is according to the typical dynamics model. But we think the first thing that flood hormones does is it enhances memory and then it impairs memory. So how exactly does it do that? We think there is a superencoding mode which happens 5 to 20 minutes after an assault. And this is where your brain, the hippocampus in particular, its functioning is enhanced so that encoding or recording of the details is enhanced, and also memory storage is enhanced at this point. But a victim survivor's brain is not like a video camera. It's not going to record everything. And what it does in the midst of stress like a sexual assault is that your attention focuses almost like tunnel vision, which is why I've got that photo of just seeing the car and everything else is a blur. Generally, what tends to be encoded most are the central details of the assault. And unfortunately, what a victim survivor thinks are the central details in that moment are not necessarily what we would want them to focus on for our purposes in terms of finding out the central details of the event. So typically what a victim survivor will remember are the most emotionally charged points in the assault. And Hopper talks about if you have a perpetrator that's facing you, the victim survivor might just remember the eyes, or they might be focusing on the passing traffic to try and escape what's being done to their body. So other details around the edges, peripheral details, might not necessarily be reliably encoded, perhaps not at all. And what happens after the superencoding mode is a minimal encoding mode. And this is where those hormones have a dampening effect on memory. And the hippocampus encoding is impaired. The minimal encoding mode may well kick in before the assault has finished. So if those kinds of details are not being encoded very well at that point, you may not, the victim survivor may not remember things like, for example, how they got home. And there was a case in the US was splashed across the media. Christine Blasey Ford accused a nominee for the US Supreme Court, Justice Kavanaugh, of sexual assault in the 1980s, when she was very publicly interviewed by a panel of senators. And one of the reasons why it was found her testimony was not credible was because she couldn't remember how she got home after the assault. And Jim Hopper was slated to actually give expert evidence in this inquiry, and unfortunately he wasn't called. But he said, you know, if he had a chance to provide this information for that inquiry, there is a very good, plausible scientific explanation for why this particular victim survivor didn't remember those details. So that's encoding. In terms of the next stage, it's consolidation. So when you remember a detail, it's not cemented in your brain at that point. So what happens is your brain undergoes a process of consolidation, processing, as we call it. Yep, no problem. And so what happens, this can happen when you are awake, and also asleep. Your brain prioritizes storage for central details, and that's understandable, isn't it? Because your brain wants to remember those events that might help you later if there's a similar event happens. Yes? So it prioritizes those flashbulb memories. Other memories can fade quite quickly. And there might be other memories that are not explicit that you can talk about, but just implicit. And these memories are stored elsewhere. And you might have just fragments of images or smells, bodily sensations, and these kinds of memories can set off a re-traumatization process of themselves when you, for example, encounter the same kind of smell. So retrieval, we know that there's super encoding mode and then minimal encoding mode, may mean that memories are fragmented or non-linear. And we do know that stress impedes retrieval and sleep helps stress. Fourthly, resisting re-traumatization, and that's key, I've kind of tried to bring it through. Lastly, revisit. And the emphasis here is on closing the loop, evaluations. And I want to flag at this point the day 3 presentation by Monica Wabuke on evaluation for you. So you'll see the sessions are going to be riveting. In terms of the regional guidelines, and this is my last slide, you'll be happy to know. If you lay them, the principles that drive the guidelines alongside the recognised best practices in the literature, you will see that the guidelines absolutely tick every box that the literature says needs to be ticked. So I commend the guidelines to you, absolutely stellar job, and they've been drafted with empathy, expertise, and you can see they line up with what the literature says should be happening here for us. So hopefully with implementation, they'll be effective in addressing sexual violence, and we will individually and collectively stand to benefit. Thanks, folks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amanda St. George, for that very insightful, very interesting presentation and on our own understanding of individual responses. There's so much that you covered, and I just sitting there, I think I tick all the boxes of being also a traumatic person. We talk about the multiple forms of trauma, you know, physical, emotional, and especially financial. So that sort of covers everybody here. But you know, thank you. This is very insightful, and having that last slide, I mean, it's very welcoming and also encouraging for the advisory panel. And yeah, okay. So thank you again. Can we give her a clap? I just have one more, announcement. If you could go back to your QR code, so please, if you could, put in the Mentimeter platform, so you can also continue to send us questions. The good thing about it, we have all this record. So every question that you feel like ask at this time, we will be recording it and possibly can provide responses that you can take with you. The copies of the presentations that you'll have at the end of the presentation, we will be able to provide them as well. So that comes to the end of the presentation for the first half of today. And we now have, does anyone have any pressing questions? Our prosecutors sometimes have prone to vulnerability when dealing with victims. Are there any guidelines that can assist prosecutors if this problem do arise, apart from referring to social services? Okay.
Sorry, I'll just repeat that answer. The short answer is there are no guidelines across the Pacific, but we're realizing and appreciating there's definitely a need. Maybe that's the next project.
Yes, I'm not aware of any guidelines myself. There's nothing that I've seen in the literature around this issue, but certainly looking at, apart from referring out, I would say there needs to be a very heightened awareness that we as activists, we don't treat trauma and we don't treat trauma, and so sometimes as empathetic people we can kind of try and provide perhaps more support than it's within our role. And this is where the prosecutor I'm thinking of in the High Court case really went above and beyond the role, and it really left her feeling very depleted, very sapped strength, and then she developed PTSD. So I think a set of guidelines around dealing with vulnerable victims, survivors would be a wonderful step forward.
Thank you very much, Suba, and also Dr. James George for this. What would a specialist trauma-informed sexual offense board need to have?
To avoid you having to read all 350 pages of my report, I will refer back to what Justice Gelder said, and pretty much all of those special measures that he mentioned in relation to Fiji are on our list of recommended best practice measures. But helpfully, if you just want to read the executive summary, they're all listed out there in bullet point format. But amongst other things, we recommend things like formally recognised victim advocates. We recommend a suite of measures, including those ones that the judge mentioned, so derobing, making the court more less of a power dynamic, use of screens, use of remote witness facilities, etc. But the report is linked on the slides, so you can just skip to the bullet points for the executive summary.
Any further questions? Yeah, well, that's our last question for now. If there are no other further questions, I think I've noted now that we finished for the first half of the day. We now have the most important part, lunch. Lunch will be served down near the restaurant, and if you could please come back at 1:30 so that we can start our first session for the second half of the day. Thank you very much.